Hi there, everybody. With all of the craziness going on these days and possibly more people spending time indoors, I thought it was about time that I put together the video I said I was going to do on the weather climate graphs that I have been doing. My intent with how I am tracking and journaling this is not to put everything into the regular art sketch journal. I kind of, like Marley Pfeiffer has mentioned about being precious, I have been a little precious with those, but also I don't have a lot of time. I'm doing a lot of other things, but I do want to pay attention to things that I can't necessarily see, but that have a strong influence on the environment around there, like weather. Over the winter, I decided that I wanted to connect a little bit more to more long-term changes and to climate change. How might I start tracking things that are unseen? And so I am using another calendar. I'm going to try and put notes about things that I'm seeing, and then hopefully I can connect it later to my graph. So here is my February graph, and the way I created these is I have a blank sheet, and this is actually you can't see it too well, it's a dot graph. You could use a blank piece of paper, but I had done a little bit of research looking at what is the typical range of weather in my area, and it looked like it wasn't much more than around 15-degree differences between the highs and lows in a month. And so that's a difference from the average. This center line is that historic average for both high and low. I would be counting if it's a positive difference or negative difference, if it's colder or warmer. And then I've measured off about the 15-degree differences that I was assuming, and sometimes I've noticed that I'm actually going further than that, but I only have so much space. These are the extremes, the record highs and the record lows historically. I'm using the same kind of color code that I have used in my other graphs for the actual temperatures. So the line is the difference from the average, and the color is the current weather. So you can kind of see an idea of current weather in perspective of how this is ranging around. And obviously the average, that historic average, came from different ranges and then averaged out. But are you going to then see a trend over time where more and more are staying higher, and so a new trend might start to be seen with this versus just ups and downs, which might be a certain range of typical weather. But I kind of want to see if I can start to see a trend, a change. And I am also seeing that there are times where there's a new record. This month had a new record high for that date. So you might have more and more records, and I just bump it up into here, even though it might be several degrees higher than what I made space for. I bump up to a new record for that date. I've also decided for more information related to wind, because the direction of the wind can be really important in whether it is a fire event, a weather event, or just your prevailing winds. So you might start to have a better idea of visualizing which direction those winds, when they're coming in. I kind of color code that. These just the red when it starts to become a more critical. Also decided to start tracking solar hours. Obviously we have a changing number of hours of sun, and in doing these weather things in the past, I started to have deeper questions about what does that mean when I'm starting to see more butterflies out there? Are they coming out because of temperature triggers and thresholds? And as I started to ask those questions and look up information, it's like, oh, it's not just temperature, it's amount of solar hours, and the same for trees. And so wouldn't it be interesting to see if once it reaches a certain point, or maybe it's a combination, maybe I'll be able to see that if I start tracking my solar hours. All right, had a dog interruption there. And what I am also kind of enjoying with doing this type of graph is then at the end of the month, I can do some summaries and find out how many days were we well above, like 5 degrees above the average or 10 degrees above the average, how many days were a new record high. And so you can start to do some summaries in there. And then I may eventually glue another layer of some kind of piece of paper visual when I want to tie things in there, but I tried to sketch some in here of the daily observations that I'm writing inside here for the days when I saw certain butterflies. I can then put them on this. Another thing that I'm trying to do, just because I had brainstormed this idea that I would have some smaller kind of hole punched and things that I can insert within each month that was something that the weather helped me learn and paying attention and tracking it. So for this particular month, it was all about the butterflies. And when I did more research, I found out that certain temperatures that butterflies and bees, they would not be able to move. And then they need warmer temperatures to warm up their muscles and allow them to then fly. And there are obviously differences between species of which ones can handle colder temperatures or warmer temperatures. And so, there seemed to be some general trends you could see between the temperatures out and butterflies and bees. And so I was like, oh, cool information. I am going to try and sketch that into this. Hopefully offered some instruction. A lot of it's experimentation. So just kind of figuring out how you want to frame your weather, how you want to color code it, because I've created my own color code, which works for the range that makes sense to me and where I'm at. But those ranges of weather and how you color code them might be different for you. So I'll show you guys some of the website information of where I get this and track it. All right, so I have some screen captures from my phone. For the most part, I am using Weather Underground. And when I go to that website, I've bookmarked it. You can go and you can change the location, and it actually, when you click on the change, it will bring up a map and then little teeny icons for where the different weather stations are. And you may not find one exactly near you, but I use the one that's closest to me. This isn't right next to me, but it's close enough for how I'm doing my weather tracking. So I picked this. Not all weather stations are gonna have a long historic record. So I think the little color codes on the map, some of them may not have historic. And so if you go to your location and you pick that one and then you try to go to down here, you'll see this little bar of different weather information. I go to history, and if that weather station doesn't have a lot of historic information, it will pop you to another closer one. So you may have to use something nearby. But I click the historic, and then I go up and I pick the dates that I want to use, and I'm going into daily. Next one here. So this is when I scroll down on that page, the first information that comes up are some graphs. And you could create your own graphs like that. I'm only interested in looking at the wind speed direction. And so I look at this for where the highest one is. And then I look at, I don't think you can see it on my screen capture here, but there's a certain time of day down here. And so I would know that at that time of day, the wind speed was this, and that was a gust. The regular winds are here, but I'm using the highest possible. And I can see the direction here. And for winds, it's the direction the wind is coming from. So this would be a south wind. And so I am putting that on my information here, the time of day that the winds came, the direction, and the speed. And then I also, when I scroll further down there, it has the time, it has temperature high and low, and the relative humidity. And from this part of the visual, I'm only looking at relative humidity. I'm looking for the lowest and the highest. So I end up putting my relative humidity high and low on my graph. And then I scroll back up and I'm looking at precip. This particular website is not very good with your real-time daily precipitation. So I have, on occasion, if I didn't put notes in my actual journal, I look at a couple of other sites for this, but it hasn't been great in showing real-time. But it does have your historic. So I'm writing down here my historic and then current precip next to it. And then here is where from my graph information, I have my record high and low for that date. So that is here, my high and my low, whichever date that is that I'm putting in there. And those are just fitting in that bar across the top. There's no measurement or math that I'm doing in that part of it. But here's the historic average. And so I am basically looking at the difference between that historic average and the actual. And so I'm going to count that difference in my little metrics here of how far up. And then I put the actual temperature high above that point, which was the difference for that high. And the same thing on that same line, I'm putting whatever the low is, the difference. And on this particular day here, both the low temperature and high temperature for the day were higher than that historic average number, which that line just represents zero difference between the average. And so that's how you do it. Each line I'm using as a date, and I'm putting on the current high and low difference from the historic average. So there is a little bit of math in figuring out where I'm going there. So hopefully that made sense on how I am doing my weather climate graph. It's part of a way of, for me, just trying to better see the unseen, and then adds a depth to some of my daily observations.